Here we go. So, oh, this is perfect timing. We are actually on time. Thank you all for joining. We are going to dive in here. This is the fourth live ultimate question. This is Jeremy Quinby. I'm excited to dive into who Jeremy is and how we know each other. And this is a live event that is combining snail mail with live video to create daringly real conversation. And we have absolutely no idea what's about to go on here. And actually, the question did not arrive in time. So we have plan B in terms of getting the question to Jeremy, which you will see here in a minute. But we will reveal that shortly. Drop in the chat if you're here. We would love to see who you, yep. All right, we got a few people coming in from Berlin here. And yes, so it's of this realness that we are about to create that we catalyze what we're not yet to even imagine. So that's where we're at. I'm Elayna. This is Jeremy. You can check out our LinkedIn profiles for the usual intro. But for now, all you need to know about me is that both within my business and beyond my business, I'm an artist, which means I approach everything I do with an artist's curiosity. And what that really means is that I fiercely and lovingly question everything around me. And that's what this space is here as well. This is an experience for all of us, not just Jeremy, but Jeremy. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being so daring to dive in with me. But this is also an experience for all of you who are here too, because without you, this would not be the same sort of thing. So tap into the energy here, the realness that we're going to create, tap into the question. Other questions will also emerge, and just follow and flow along with us. So without further ado, Jeremy, I'm going to introduce you. And
Okay.
Jeremy and I, this is a little bit different because Jeremy and I actually met in person a few weeks ago here in
And
Berlin.
before that.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true. We've met twice in person,
Yep.
once in Minneapolis, right? That was
Yep.
how many
Yep.
years ago?
At least two, maybe three, maybe four.
Yeah, gosh. And the second time was just a few weeks ago here in Berlin because Jeremy reached out to me on, lo and behold, LinkedIn and say, hey, I know this is a long shot, but I'm in Berlin tomorrow. And we ended up getting together for drinks, dinner, and Jeremy actually canceled his hotel reservation and stayed here at my apartment with my partner and I. So I'd say
Wonderful
it was a good
host.
time. Yeah, I'd say it was a good time. But the reason that Jeremy and I know each other is because Jeremy is my sister's massage therapist. He does a lot of
Craniosacral therapist and other
yeah.
things.
Well, why don't you say that because you're going to be better. Say a little bit. What are the three, or how do you define your body work?
It's a little hard, but I've kind of been in a bodywork field for about 26 years, but I've also combined with movement work. So it's kind of a combination of things. I think of that movement work as also being sort of part of a healing process too.
Yeah.
And combining those pieces for people, I end up kind of working between a lot of different fields of health because I also treat newborns with craniosacral therapy. And because I've been doing that for 17 years, I now treat kids of all ages and I treat older people. And so I kind of think of, it's almost like being an old style family doctor where I get to work with an entire community of people. And I've done that now in two different places, in Brooklyn, New York, and in Minneapolis. And I still work between the two of them, which is nothing I planned in my career.
And how could you? One of
Yeah.
those unexpected things that you found, and that this space is for too. So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was a perfect little intro there, better than I could have done. So that's the space that Jeremy's coming from. But we also have Plan B, and there is an envelope involved in Plan B to unveil this ultimate question. So if you're new here, the way that the ultimate question works is that after Jeremy and I had this wonderful night here in Berlin, and I invited him to do the ultimate question, and I sat with that for a little while looking for his question. And then when that question emerged, I put it in the post. It has not arrived yet, but we have our Plan B. So that question is going to kick off our conversation. So Jeremy, why don't you show us our Plan B?
Well, I gotta I got an envelope with looks like it's from you.
Oh,
Let's see what we got in here.
wait, hold on. Don't see anything too soon because I didn't want to do this before. All right. Sent.
There.
Oh, it's yeah.
Oh, it's my phone with the message.
Plan B.
All right. And the question is, what do you need to follow? What do I need to follow? Is this where I start?
So you get to decide. We can explore around that question. We can explore straight into it. Whatever is coming up for you is exactly where we need to go.
What do I need to follow? I mean, I would say this is kind of an interesting question for me because my background is I was an English major. I never really planned on going to into a science field or a healing arts field or anything. But like you, I also kind of consider my all of my work to be kind of in an art related space. I think of healing arts. I'm also a musician. I was planning to go. I went to writing school. I was planning to kind of get into writing, and then I guess this is the other thing I didn't mention is that I've been hosting a podcast for the last 7 years where I've brought all these different pieces of myself together where I write a lot for the podcast. I use my audio skills, and I wrote the music for the podcast. So
Oh,
I kind of got to do all the different pieces. So what do I need to do? Wait, what's the question again?
yeah,
Let
right,
me get
right,
this straight.
yeah.
Well, what do I need to follow? What do I need to follow? Um, I think this was something that I was really struggling with in my 20s. I'm now 53 for anybody who's wondering what the age gap is between this and then. But I was struggling with some back problems at the time as a musician, trying to kind of build a little bit of a career for myself, doing that, recording, gigging, and doing all this stuff, and also holding another side job, which is what most artists and musicians end up doing. And so that period of time I feel like was a bit of a like spiritual crisis of sorts. I was trying to
Mm,
really figure out what it is that I need to follow because I think that was really where I was struggling. And I obviously I worked in restaurants and had temp jobs and worked for the newspaper for a period of time and at office work. And I was really also trying to do a lot of writing and spending every morning writing, getting myself up early to do this stuff. But I found that what I kind of needed to follow, I would say, was some kind of something as simple as I needed to follow more movement. I
hmm,
found that when I was sort of moving and engaged, the, the things that I was trying to capture, I think, in writing and music and all these things, really had some sort of relationship to like how I felt in my physical body. And
hmm.
I feel like that changed a lot of things for me. And it's kind of what I guess I've spent most of my career trying to help, people, even if they've I find a lot of people end up becoming very disengaged from their physical body. We live in this sort of contained space a lot of times, trying to figure out, trying to process, trying to think we can solve things with just pure cognition. But I find that the more people kind of drop into their bodies, what they need to follow usually kind of comes from the bodies. And I might explain later on how this relates to craniosacral therapy because there's a really fascinating aspect of this in that.
Yeah, well, I wanna explore with you because we think that our mind is going to be able to tell us where to go next, and we also hear about our hearts and our gut.
Right.
But when you think about the body and you say the body, what is that what does that really mean to you? But actually, let me get even more specific. I wanna be really specific to you. So
Okay.
not you telling me, like, the theory for maybe me, but, like, for you, when you think about following your body, what does that mean?
So this is where things get very interesting because the way that I sort of understand the body is probably very different than the way a lot of people understand the body. I don't know how into the weeds you want to get it with this stuff, but my real interest in the body started because of chronic pain. So I started having chronic back pain in my 20s during that time period where I think I was in this, crisis of sorts. And I think I use that period of time a lot because I'm trying to figure out how do I, where does that come from? Where does that discomfort come from?
Mm.
And so, the way we experience so many different things comes through the body. And so that really led me into like really kind of trying to understand, you know, the different aspects of what the body experiences. So, when we get into like the emotional part of the body, where does that come from? Do you have any thoughts on that? I'm just curious as somebody who's also experienced my work. So
I mean, there's yeah, uh in terms of where it comes from, no, I haven't explored that question. But in terms of like understanding that I'm feeling something and feeling within my body, yeah, definitely. Um, it's been recently that I have really tuned into that in a different way,
Mhm.
where I am learning to ask myself that question soon after I'm aware enough to acknowledge that I am having an emotion, and that process in and of itself is yeah. I mean, I don't have that down. But what
Right.
about for you? Like in terms of you following your body, what does that look like?
So that's kind of where this comes in is like I like to use the emotions as like a starting point kind of into
Yeah,
the body sometimes because you know emotions are temporary, right? We sometimes mistake sort of the states that we're in for the emotion that comes through, right? So and I've if anyone's interested in kind of digging into this, I have a therapist friend who I dug into this with in a podcast episode. Her name's Karin Weidenmuller. She's also German, and I've worked with her for probably 15 years or so, on and off, with both her and her family, but also with a lot of her patients and clients. And one of the things that she sort of talks about is that the emotions are really our teachers. They're really there to sort of give a lesson of sorts and cause us to make some decisions. So like we think about sort of the more negative emotions like fear or anger or something like that to be sort of on the negative side of the emotion. And my question for people a lot of times is also where do you feel that emotion in your body, right? Because that's sort of the starting point in when we're getting into the physiology of the body. But a lot of times what she was explaining is that anger is, we don't want to experience it, right? So we're trying to avoid that, but not expressing anger or not sort of paying attention to the anger. Sometimes it doesn't have to, it has to be expressed appropriately, right? That's the sort of the trick. But anger is oftentimes about us needing to set some sort of boundary, which
mm,
is like a very simple thing. So as it relates to like me and my body, I think this was something that I didn't have any understanding of when I was younger, right? So the things that I think I was sort of processing at the time were a lot of, frustration, probably. Like that's where how it was sort of coming through in my body. Where I was experiencing it was in my low back and my hips a lot of times. So it was sort of interesting. But what that sort of helped me, dig into with my work was this whole autonomic nervous system and how we have these, people are sort of aware of this idea of this fight or flight side. The opposite side of that system is the rest and digest and recovery side of the system. And one of the things that what I'm always kind of trying to get some sense of with somebody is where are they on that spectrum? Because it's a prioritized system, so that when one goes up, the other one kind of goes down, and that's just because that's where the energy in the system needs to go. And so that causes lots of hormonal reactions that also sort of stimulate different kinds of things. So, you know, that whole idea of me feeling like I needed to follow my body really meant that I had to tune in and understand how am I paying attention to this part of myself as I'm moving forward towards the things that I'm really, whatever my targets are. We can get so caught up in like just wanting to like hit the target that we push a lot of things aside. And so the body for me was something that I realized. I was very driven when I was younger. I played sports. I was very involved in sports. And then all of a sudden I switched into music, got really into that. And then I was really into writing. And then I all of a sudden, as soon as I got into the bodywork field, decided to kind of shift into that. I got so into the sciences. And because I was a reader, just read everything. But I also always felt like my system couldn't settle. Like I was just always pushing, pushing, pushing.
Mm,
So for me, I feel like there was this thing that I really needed to pay more attention to, which was how does my physical body, you know, feel doing this? And that was kind of that was also sort of where I was, and in a way, being directed. Does the we talk about like the gut or gut instinct or something, but that gut instinct I think really has to do with when we're sort of not in the right space, our gut actually gets shut down. Right. So when we're in that sort of fight or flight, manic state, whatever it is that we're in, so I think our gut does sort of tell us something, or that part of the body. So when I'm working with people, a lot of times it's really about kind of developing this dialogue with themselves and their body.
yeah. How does that dialogue look for you?
What does the dialogue look like for me?
Yeah, like when because I think it's really important to understand your relationship with
Yeah.
following your body. And now when we think about like from this moment and today, how does like what does Jeremy need to follow? Well, he's known that he needs to follow his body.
Yeah. Yeah.
What does that look like day to day? First in the idea of following, but it also now we're bringing in that idea of dialogue
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So talk to me about what that looks like for you.
So from the beginning part of that for me was actually, taking some meditation courses, trying to study meditation. And I think for me, that was the beginning of learning how to sort of tap into what was going on in my body, but having a practice of doing it. And it wasn't like an extreme practice. I was doing like 10 minutes a day. But I was really religious about it for probably close to 10 years. I think in some ways I shifted from that a little bit. I would say my dialogue with my body now has to do with a lot of different interaction. I think it's usually moving. There's still some meditative things that I do. And the other thing that I think I talked to you about this a little bit is that for me, music also ends up being this sort of channel of dialogue of sorts,
Mm,
because I always find it's interesting. Like, so I have, usually like 3 or 4 nights a week, I'll sit down and just, tinker with something that I'm working on. But the things that I choose to work on song wise, and it might be other people's music, or it might be something that I'm working on my own, but it tends to be something that probably has some emotional content to it that I'm processing, whether I can consciously bring it up or not. But you know, I definitely feel something in my body when I'm doing that, and I think there's something about having that regular experience that I'm sure it's lighting up all sorts of stuff electrochemically. That's sort of part of the experience. But I do think because we are sort of energetic, beings, and we sort of hold on to all sorts of things that we don't have different. We're often looking for different opportunities to process it. I find that I tend to do it either through movement or through music. And that's kind of where I feel like my dialogues tend to happen the most these days.
yeah, interesting. I kind of forgot that you said like you were differentiating between movement and music, and I was in this place of experiencing music as
Mm,
movement
yeah,
because of course there is a movement to that, but also like the frequency in which our eardrums are vibrating to receive that and then
or
that
even the guitar against your chest, you can feel, as you're
yeah.
playing, you can feel it. I also play drums. I'm not, I wouldn't call myself a drummer, but it is one of those things that I actually physically feel the need to do once in a while. And it also takes you into a space, especially something like drums, where you can't really focus on anything else. So
Mm,
because you've got, 4 limbs trying to do different kinds of things, it it does something to your brain where I always feel like it kind of scrambles everything. Whatever I was focused on that I felt like was that I was struggling to process or was a stressor from my day, it kind of just goes away, and it doesn't come back very quickly after I play music. I always feel like it gives me that spacer that I need.
interesting, yeah. Well, and I like expanding that further because I don't play music. I listen to music a lot, especially right now. I've been doing a lot of writing. I listen to a certain kind of music to tap me into that space.
Hmm.
And I think that a lot of people do that, but I've been really conscious around understanding the inspiration that comes from that and curating these different things around me to welcome and bring and bolster in that inspiration. I don't know. The concreteness in which I build that container, I think, is something that's new for me in the last few years. But then my art, like there is movement in art, and
Yeah.
sometimes I look at that as being a very sedentary kind of thing because I'm usually sitting down. And so sometimes I'm like, dang, I should be out moving around. But really, there's a whole current and a whole movement, even in the slightest little lines that I make.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I'm liking this depth in which we are exploring this one thing as movement. And it makes me want to ask you around the idea of when you are not moving in accordance to what you need to. How does that hold back your emotions, or what's the relationship between not moving correctly with the emotions that need to be moved?
Um, I think one of the, I would just, I don't, this might be a slight aside, but looking at this question now from a slightly different point of view,
Yeah.
um, I actually also struggle to not move sometimes.
I love it, love it, let's go. Please take us.
So, I think that's the balance I'm always kind of trying to
Mm,
play with a little bit is, how do I do in stillness and how do I do in movement? Because, I think I've gotten into a practice. I think, like I was saying in my 20s, I was really focused on writing and music. And so writing and music both required me to sort of be still and in a place a little bit more,
yeah,
especially because I was sort of newer to music. I think there was a lot of, and also the way when you're picking up something new, there's a lot of study that goes on, and so it's not the same as the way that I play music now, if that makes sense.
mhm,
Um, and so I think at that point I started just feeling too kind of I felt like my body needed to be doing more physically, like it needed to be kind of moving through space and more physically. But now I feel like I've actually adapted all these different routines into my life. My work is movement. I have to, because my work is physical. I also feel like I have to keep up a certain kind of routine of sort of physical regimen to keep myself in good shape, and that involves all sorts of whether it's exercise or what I call my prehab exercises, so I don't end up with injuries, stuff from my work, and stretching and mobility exercises and stuff. But and then music, and then being a parent and doing all the things that I do, like I can stay very, very active very easily now. Now I feel like it's kind of shifted for me into like really planning for periods of stillness and rest,
mm,
and even just like simple contemplation. Like I don't think I have to be doing anything, like at one point I felt like just sitting in a space and being someplace was something that I didn't have time for because I had all these things I wanted to accomplish. Now I feel like I need to make those spaces where I'm not necessarily, being productive, but that just being is actually a productive thing now.
okay, yes. I I like the idea of not being productive. There's not enough space in the world for that, and in general conversation. But then I also liked the way that you talked about being productive. So I want to dive in there a little bit deeper with you in terms of how you see following. Let's continue using that
Oh, the
word.
following. Okay.
How you see following non-productivity. What the hell does that mean? And, like, how are you doing it? How are you doing it?
My guess is I haven't had much time to process this, but I feel like the that part of my life now probably relates to all my relationships. You know, really continuing to make sure that I'm connecting with people in that way, and and it's sort of for me anyways, it's an easy way to maybe bring in some of the stillness aspects that I need to do where I'm just spending time with people. I mean, I feel like our day was a perfect example if I can share this with
Yeah,
anybody.
yeah,
Is that right?
yeah.
I mean, so I came from a bus ride and I was up late the night before seeing a friend and spending, not going to sleep early enough. I came back, I took a nap at your place.
Yeah, that was, like, the first thing you did.
It was awesome, and you were working, and so that wrapped up perfectly. And then you said, this is what we like to do, on Fridays in Berlin. We went down to the store downstairs, got beers, and then just walked through the market and kind of walked around the streets holding beers,
Yeah.
um, and kind of wandering through crowds of people. And then we went to this great bridge that's not too far from you, where they have these places where you can kind of sit on a little, I guess they're cement parts of the bridge or whatever, but the whole bridge was full of people on the sides and cars were honking because there's too many people and they wanted to get through. It was kind of awesome. And there's somebody playing music, some like 80s and 90s music, it seemed like.
Yep.
And we just sat there for a while and continued a conversation like this. And then got up and wandered to another place and sat down and had a little spritz and had some more conversation, and then figured out, walked around looking for a place to have some food. And then your partner came and met us, and then wandered to another place to have the restaurant later on to have a glass of wine. But in between that, we really saw a lot of your area and all the nightlife that was going on. And like, that would probably be all considered non-productive time,
Yeah.
right? But that was my whole experience of, my day in Berlin, that I got to see stuff, and I hadn't been to Berlin since 1992. So that's that, for me to see the difference of Berlin, to see all the people, to see how the city and the energy of the city, and Berlin's got a little bit of a Wild West flair, almost kind of like 1990s New York or something. It's a very different vibe,
Yeah.
than I remember from the past. And so, like, that was all, fairly non-productive. And also the great thing about traveling and also having someone to show you their city that way is that, there was nothing productive going on, but that being was really what it was all about.
Yes. Wow. Yes. I'm sitting here thinking that sometimes I notice I've got certain friends that just wanna chill, and I feel like, or like when I'm with my sister sometimes, back in Minneapolis, which
Hmm.
is where you're at, and it's a Saturday, there's nothing really to do, and you're just chilling, and I don't always know how to do that. I think this is
Mm,
a really interesting place to go, because sometimes it's completely comfortable to, like, be welcomed into a new place and have, like, this, uh, kind of this bridge between the being, because we weren't really doing anything, but also the backdrop of everything, and having both of those things, the productivity in a sense
yeah.
of being able to see a new place, but not having any expectations of what that means, which then makes me think about travel. And so much of travel and seeing new places is of that. And what I really mean by that is that a lot of times it takes us getting back from a trip to understand what we've done,
Yeah, oh, yeah.
right? And like, how perfect when we're thinking about the work that we do to think about it that same way. How often is it exactly the same thing? I mean, I've spent these last 6 months building something new, and so often during that time, I didn't feel like I was doing anything.
Yeah.
But it is only since I launched my website on Wednesday, that I can now look back on those 6 months and tell you what each piece meant.
Right.
And so thinking about your time here and, like, looking at each drink that we had, because really that's sort of what moved us through the night.
Yep, yep.
Um, yeah, that's perfect.
And I think there's also a part of this. Maybe I would change with more time thinking about this. I think there's also kind of part of this whole thing about movement is probably related to some kind of flow state.
Mm,
Because even like thinking about my experience traveling and seeing all the people that I saw, and sort of it was a packed schedule, 2 weeks. I hadn't been to Europe for 15 years, and wanting to like see as many people as I possibly could, have these different experiences. I still had to stay tuned in to like my family stuff and a little bit of work stuff, but I tried to really set some boundaries around my work stuff so that, if I didn't get to an email or a text or whatever, I just, I let enough people know that I wasn't going to be around. Somebody new contacting me would probably have to just see from my email that I'm on vacation, but I still try to get back to people. But that whole idea of I think flow state for me, it wraps up the movement part of things, but also the stillness part, because I feel like that's kind of the thing that I'm trying to keep threaded throughout that whole thing is I want to kind of stay engaged. I think moving my body and staying physical on some level is where I feel the best,
mhm.
and whatever that balance is between movement and stillness keeps me in that flow state where I just, am able to stay engaged at a certain level.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. I This conversation around doing and being is so big,
Hmm.
especially in, like, the entrepreneur and business space. But to simplify that and to look at movement being, a different way of looking at it, or a metaphor of sorts, because we can all acknowledge that we need sleep and there's not movement in sleep.
Yeah.
And then we all feel better when we go for a walk. And for those of us who are, I mean, I'm doing yoga often and all of that kind of stuff. And like my surfboard's back here. Do
Hmm.
not surf in Berlin, but you can surf in Munich. I don't surf in Munich. It's a river. Anyway, oops. Lots of things going on here as I'm starting to think about my favorite way of moving. Um, but yeah, I feel like there's a lot of insight for all of us to touch into movement, not just as like my body and understanding how it moves, but really the whole idea of how I'm being and moving and doing, and then the emotional compass that our
Right.
bodies also encapsulate.
Right. I
Yeah.
mean, the thing that I got that I think drew me in with my, having had a pain issue and working with people with a lot of physical discomfort issues or health challenges or whatever, is is that the body is the storehouse of all sorts of information. We think about the brain as being just everything, that all the
Mhm.
information is there, but really the nervous system, beyond the brain is its external hard drive. And how we s- and the way that we sort of that emotions, move through our bodies. We sort of know that idea of like holding our heart when something happens, or feeling butterflies in our stomach, or those kinds of things. We know that there's stuff passing through all the time. I mean, it's fairly simple, but it's something that you really have to kind of ground people in to be able to sort of stay in that state. I think this is one of our big challenges as a society right now, is that we use all sorts of kinds of distractions to to almost stay out of our bodies.
Yeah.
And I that's one of the things that I think having different kinds of practices that do stay engaged that way. I mean, I guess your question is sort of interesting. In my English major part of my brain is kind of thinking about the word follow, and so like that is almost suggesting movement,
Mm,
right there, that there needs to be something to go towards.
yeah.
And I guess that's maybe the question is, what are we going towards for
Yeah.
ourselves, right?
Yeah. I like looking at it that way too, the towards part. Let's flip it on its head.
Okay.
So the initial question was, what do you need to follow? And flipping it on its head, it would become, in my eyes right now, it would become, what is it that you need to lead?
Hmm. That's interesting. And in some ways, the interesting thing about that, for me anyways, is that I was kind of planning to be a teacher. I think that was in some ways going to be my path had I stayed on the sort of literature and writing path. Um, I didn't love academia. I think that's really what kept me out. I did have a few opportunities to do some teaching and working with some kids, but there was something about that space that didn't work right for me.
Mm,
But I do think that what I need to lead, and and this might also relate to me being a parent, but I feel like there's a lot of example that needs to go on, but also all the things that I'm sort of talking about with you, and conversations that we've had. I think there's a part of if you see something clearly enough, or if you have enough experience. I mean, I've done over 25,000 sessions with people in my practice, which is a lot for someone even in my field. And there was a long time in there where I still felt a lot of imposter syndrome. I would say even 10 years ago, I was still feeling this way. Even as I started, when I was starting the podcast, I had this moment where I was kind of feeling like, what, who am I to talk about this stuff? I think we all kind of go through those things, even though, like, I've had thousands of hours of having conversations about these topics. It still felt like, am I really any sort of authority on this stuff? And so that was kind of a challenging thing. But I knew at some point, I actually, I don't know if I shared this with you, but I took an improv class. I think we talked about this for
I
some
think we did
reason.
too, yeah.
I took an improv class as I was starting the podcast, because a friend of mine sort of talked me into doing this thing and was like, "Oh, it'd be really good. It's like good practice and kind of getting things started." So I did, and then he actually ended up not sticking around for the class. Like, he came to a few classes and left, and I went through the whole thing. But the one thing that I found interesting, everybody kind of knows the yes and part of
Mhm.
improv, where you never say no to anything, because that just kind of kills whatever direction the bit's going. But but the big thing that I picked up from it was that at some point during an act that you're doing with somebody else, whether it's like a partner or a group of people or something, someone has to make a declaration, meaning like, I think, I need, I want. And if you don't do that, you don't really give anybody anything to play off of. It's like, so that was the thing that I picked up in terms of, I mean, it's that's every relationship, but that's one of the other things that I realized about that. But as it related to me, maybe this is in some sort of a leadership position, is that, like, we have to kind of we have to have an opinion, and we have to be willing to be wrong, and get whatever that reaction is. And I think that actually really helped me a lot. It was like, I think in this, also my past, I would say that I've had tendencies to want everything to be like the way that I sort of go through a process. I want to get it to, like, as close to perfection as possible. And I don't think that way anymore at all, which is like, I feel
Mhm.
like I can so much more easily go through things and just and adapt and react and hear the mistakes. And this, the other thing is, like, when you record yourself in a podcast, you have to also edit yourself all the time, which is not a fun process at the beginning. And you start hearing all your isms and all these things that you have to sort of deal with, like, yep, that's me. So I think that was kind of a really good experience in terms of understanding. You know, I think maybe being a leader meant just being comfortable, more comfortable with all the parts of myself, not just the ones that I wanted to showcase.
Yeah. Yeah, and, like, the rawness and the mosaic that those create is what you bring to the world and allows you to create this space. I'm thinking about your podcast right
Yeah,
now.
yeah,
Allows you to create the space that is not going to exist anywhere else. And the only time that that isn't true is when we are trying to box ourselves into what this should be. And now there's a huge caveat here because we will always have those shoulds around us somewhere. And like that's
Hmm.
part of what this process of life and navigating the unknown is all about, is understanding when those are inhibiting you. Because I've also noticed that in the process of learning, the first thing that we do is we copy what's around us.
Right.
And that is 100% okay. So it might
Yeah.
mean that we sound like somebody else in the way that we are conducting the interview or regurgitating some information. But what
Creating
I
music,
find,
whatever. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And art, I mean,
Right.
yeah. But what I
Everyone's
find,
stealing.
yes, yeah. And what I find is really interesting about it, especially when we're talking about like regurgitation of words, is that humans are notoriously horrible at that. So no matter how much you try to encapsulate what Nietzsche said, I don't know why I just said that, where that came from, but like even if you're trying, like whoever you're trying to kind of quote, it's going to start changing the more that you talk about it. And that's one of those places that I love to explore
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
let that happen. Because that's when you start to see where your perspective really is, because the thing about our perspectives is that they're so of us, we don't know where they're at. And yeah.
And putting yourself out there, I think, is a really important part. We talk about leadership. You can't lead, in the dark. You have to be seen,
Yeah.
and that's part of a growth process. That's the
Mhm.
one thing doing any project like you're doing here requires way more effort than people ever, realize. They just sort of see the end product. And so the whole process of the podcast for me, on top of having a full-time career in two cities, being parents and all these things, it's a lot to kind of keep going. And I haven't been religious about my schedule, but I've got 145 episodes, and my whole goal with it was just to create content and resource, and to also kind of stimulate a dialogue around what health even is in the first
Mhm.
place. What, again, like, what's the target? What
Yeah.
do you want to be healthy for what? What's the aim here, right?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
does health even look like to you? Those kinds of questions. And also bridging a lot of dialogues between what has become much more of a holistic care model. Even people in the westernized allopathic care system are much, I found, were much more interested in my kind of work than I thought they would be as I was kind of getting further along. And I was actually becoming more interested in like what they knew and how to use that resource, even though, health system work maybe better in Germany than in the US. But health systems can be very challenging places depending on where you land, and how you get pushed around in the system. So I felt like I needed to kind of explore, you know that in my work. But that's kind of, that that being engaged in this whole process through the podcast was really where my growth came from. In this, even though it's so many hours, part of it was putting myself out there and getting responses and letting my audience tell me what they needed. And my guests would surprise me with things that I never thought I was going to, direction I never thought I was going to have an interest. And so I think that some part of, back to the leadership thing, I think part of leadership is being willing to stay in that curious space and not feel like, you need to know everything. I feel like I've gotten much better about really understanding over this time period that I've been doing it, what my real skill set and, knowledge base is, and maybe intuitive skills and all these things that I've kind of learned from my work. It's helped me really appreciate what I have, but also what I don't. And that's been super helpful for me, because again, it's kind of, there's some boundaries that are set up in there that give me a little bit more freedom to just do more and more of what I want to do.
Mhm. Yeah. I feel like what you've just given us is the intersection, or almost like combining the idea of following with leading into
Mm,
curiosity, because
yeah,
both
yeah,
of them require curiosity, and curiosity is so much about following something, and
yeah.
it's also about leading something. I've never experienced curiosity
Hmm.
in quite that flavor before. So I feel like
Yeah.
that's where I'm noticing the time, and I feel like that is like the the perfect way to bring all of this together, which is never what I try to do. And actually, my last question for you, Jeremy, is
Uh-oh.
rather than tying this beautiful little bow that we just did on this conversation, what question has emerged for you? What question is in the space now?
What question has emerged for me? I'm always curious because I don't get this enough. I'm curious to know if anyone else, and I don't know if you do this on the show ever, but I'm curious to know if anybody else has a question. Is that possible?
I mean, yes, we're at time,
We're
but
at
if
time? Okay.
anybody is here with, I mean, and also with the replay, questions are welcome here too.
Okay.
One of the things that I think about with this space is that it's such a conversation
Yeah.
that I'm always trying to figure out how to stay completely focused on
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
and then
Okay.
there's everybody else experiencing this with us. So I like that your question is the question of, are there questions? That's kind of a really meta thing to flow through. So uh, we're getting why well, I'm not going to invite this now because I want to honor everybody's time, including yours, Jeremy. But the question
Yeah.
that did just come in was, why is being important, or why is being in our bodies, or wait, why is being important for our bodies? So we
Oh,
can all
that's a good
ponder that.
question.
Yeah, we can all ponder that as well. I want to thank you, Jeremy, for being here, and I want to thank everyone else for joining us here and tapping into the realness that we're exploring. And I also want to make an announcement, because the ultimate question now has a home, and it is here. I'm going to get a URL, but it hasn't happened yet. It's on my website, which just launched. So it's just elaynasnyder.com/the ultimate question with hyphens in between. You can see that here on the screen, and I'll drop a comment later on, and you can find us there. But Jeremy, thank you so much for being here. Your question will be up, and
I'll
it,
throw this out there too. If anybody wants to, reach me and ask
yes,
me a
please.
question, how's that sound?
That I was, yes, definitely,
So
please.
my podcast is Highway to Health podcast,
Wait, with
and
a
you can
two?
no with to, yeah,
Okay,
Highway to Health, and highway to dot health is the website. You can also send me a question if you have any questions about what we went through today, at Jeremy at highway to dot health. Jeremy
cool.
at highway to dot health. So I like to get questions from people. I feel like it also creates some movement in where I end up going with the podcast. So
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, and thank you for reminding me there, because I did want to make that invitation. So I'm glad that you brought that back for us. And yes, we're all happy to hear from you. Connect with us, and we will continue the curiosity, the following, and the questions, and the leading. That was the other piece there, too. So, well,
love
thank
it.
you so much.
Thank you, Elayna.